very special presentation for us. So I'm going to turn it over to Jill to make some introductions and to get us started for today.
Thanks, Jesse. I'm going to go ahead and start with the land acknowledgement. The Konza Prairie LTER acknowledges the connection of Indigenous peoples to these lands, and we pledge to respect and honor the past and current legacy, cultural history, and knowledge of these people. Through our professional capacity as scientists and educators, we will work to increase our knowledge of the human legacy of these lands, and in turn will teach this history to others. And so with that in mind, we have our program today that we're really excited about. We're pleased to welcome Pauline Sharp and Annette Voth to our meeting today. Pauline Sharp is a citizen of the Kaw Nation, and Annette Voth is a descendant of Russian Mennonites. These ladies have graciously agreed to enact a program in which they portray their ancestors, a presentation entitled One History, Two Stories. So I give to you, Pauline Sharp and Annette Voth. Over to you, ladies.
Guten Morgen. Good morning. I'm Annette Voth, a cradle Mennonite born of Low German ancestry, born in the Gossel Hospital in Marion County. I grew up in a Mennonite farm community surrounded by people who shared my history and culture, and I have lived most of my life in the nearby community of Elbing. 12 of my 16 great-great-grandparents and 16 of their
misspelling all kinds
and 16, let's see, and 6 of their children, my great-grandparents, were among the Alexandroville immigrant group who came to Kansas in 1874 from the Molochne area of South Russia, now Ukraine.
Away, excuse me. Away, Jaje Widiche, Pauline Sharp. Hello, my name is Pauline Sharp. I'm a Kaw Nation citizen, and I currently serve as chair of the Konza Heritage Society. We're the tribe from whom the state of Kansas took its name. I have lived in the Wichita area most of my life. The Konza people were forcibly removed from Kansas in 1873, just months before the Mennonites immigrated to this land. We thought it would be interesting to share our stories side by side to contrast how the indigenous people were treated compared to the immigrants.
If you permit, I'm going to share my slide, my screen now.
And I am going to interject one note here. If you have not, please mute your audio. If you have not, please go ahead and do that. Thank you.
Before Europeans came to this land, the Konza people roamed the plains freely. There was no concept of private ownership, although general boundaries were honored between tribes. The land was a fundamental part of Native American life. The earth was part of their being, part of their self. There was a dynamic interaction between the weather, plants, animals, and water. The Sioux people say we are all related. Everything has life, even the stones.
I grew up hearing stories about how my ancestors valued religious freedom and were willing to leave everything behind and move to a new land so that they could practice their beliefs. I learned that Mennonites were known as successful farmers and that we prided ourselves on our hard work, our frugality, and our skill. My great-great-grandparents came to a land that they saw as wild and unsettled. They saw it as raw material for building a home and a life for themselves, their families, and their church community. They believed that land that could be farmed should be farmed. They believed that they were to fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over creation. In 1493, the Pope had declared that if land wasn't used for farming or other European purposes, it didn't belong to anyone. So European powers could take lands and peoples for themselves. This was known as the doctrine of discovery. They could discover and colonize lands as if they were empty. This idea was introduced into US law by the Supreme Court in 1823. It denied the validity of long-standing systems of indigenous governance and sovereignty, and resulted in the exploitation of Native peoples, extraction of natural resources without regard for indigenous rights, and the extermination of many indigenous people.
The Konza were part of a larger group, which included the Osage, Omaha, Ponca, and Quapaw. The group migrated west from the Ohio River Valley. They began breaking into smaller tribes when they reached the Mississippi River. The Konza and the Osage stayed together the longest, finally separating at the Missouri River. The first recorded Konza village locations in Kansas were on the Missouri River, north of its confluence with the Kansas River. These villages were later abandoned, and the Kaw people began settling on the Kansas or Kaw River. There were several villages along this river, including the Blue Earth settlement near present-day Manhattan.
Many Mennonites, including my ancestors, moved multiple times to obtain land, religious freedom, and economic opportunity. In the mid-1500s, they moved from Flanders to near Amsterdam. Then in the first half of the 17th century, moved again to West Prussia, now Poland, where they settled near the small village of Czechowka, south of Danzig. The area had been devastated in the Polish-Teutonic Wars of 1519 through 21 and was further damaged by a severe flood shortly after. In 1562, a Danzig city merchant and city councilor, Michael Leutz, invited Dutch Mennonites to settle in Delta area that he had leased from the Polish king, and to use windmills, drainage ditches, and dikes to turn the wetlands into farmland.
Kaw Nation is a federally recognized Indian tribe. Our name is written in our language as Konza. Since the second syllable is barely audible, this was shortened to Kaw in the early 1800s by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Our official name with the government is the Kaw Nation of Oklahoma, but we prefer the name Konza or Konza people. In 1673, a map maker recorded us as Kanza Indians, and in 1861, the state of Kansas took its name from this first historical reference, without ever asking our permission. We are known as the people of the South Wind. They lived in earth or bark lodges. There were gardens tended by the women. Even when they lived on the Kansas River, they maintained hunting camps in central Kansas. They hunted buffalo at least 3 times a year, once in the spring, then again in the autumn and winter when the bison had their best coat. The majority of the tribe would travel for the hunt, leaving behind only those too frail or sick for the journey and a few caregivers. The men were expert hunters, and the women would tan and dress the hides to be used for trade. The bison were not just food, they were life, providing clothing, tools, heat, rope, and even housing. Because furs and robes were the only trade commodities available to the tribe, access to the animals was crucial.
My ancestors remained in Czechowka and the surrounding area for the next 250 years, but life grew increasingly difficult. Community members weren't able to buy the land they farmed or find additional land for their sons. Educational opportunities were limited, there was a lack of freedom to worship as they wished, and it was becoming harder to avoid military conscription. So in 1820, having heard favorable reports from earlier Mennonite immigrants to South Russia, the larger part of the Czechowka, later known as Alexanderville church group, migrated to the Mleczna colony, where they stayed for the next 53 years. The move to Mleczna was made possible because the Russian government wanted good farmers for land, just acquired through war. But settlers who moved on to the steppes did not settle on vacant land. When the Jakovka church group moved to Molochna in 1820, they lived alongside the Nogai as well as other ethnic groups. The Nogai were nomadic herders who had held land in common and owned only what they could carry. In the late 1700s, Catherine the Great had resettled many of the Nogai from the Caucasus to Molochna, soon deciding that they should become farmers. The first encounter between the Mennonites and the Nogai came in 1803, when the state evicted 5 Nogai villages from prime sites along the banks of the Molochna River to make way for the first Mennonite immigrants. Both the Russian government and my ancestors believed the Mennonites were setting a good example for the local folk. David C. Weedle in the Story of Alexandroville notes that one could point out also that the Russian hired help took back much from the Mennonite farms where they had worked. For some of the Russians, Mennonites were model farmers, unquote. In the coming years, Mennonites provided agricultural jobs to Nogai and rented pasture from them. John R. Staples, in his article on civilizing the Nogai in the Mennonite Quarterly Review, argued that this had short-term positive effects, but long-term negative outcomes. While the economy flourished, the Mennonite economy flourished, the Nogai economy failed. Soon the Nogai left for Turkey, and the Mennonites lost the land they had been renting from them. This was a significant factor igniting the Mennonite landlessness crisis of the 1860s and their subsequent emigration to Kansas.
Prior to the Treaty of 1825, the Kaw domain was 20 million acres. The 1825 treaty reduced the amount to 2 million acres. The Treaty of 1846 removed them from their villages on the Kansas River to the Neosho River Valley on 256,000 acres, with the Santa Fe Trail running right through the heart of their home. This was followed by the 1859 treaty, which removed the thriving trade center of Council Grove from their reservation, and they were left with a 9 by 14 square mile tract of 80,000 acres. In exchange for the land, they received funds for education and agricultural assistance, plus annuities amounting to $8,000 a year, and the assurance of the President of the United States that this land shall remain for their use forever. Contact with Europeans brought diseases like smallpox and cholera. Some years the hunts were unsuccessful because of terrible drought, leaving the tribe destitute and without sufficient food to satisfy the demands of hunger. Then, as the hunting grounds were overrun with white squatters, the Konza were in desperate and violent competition with other powerful tribes for the prime hunting land. The 1870s proved disastrous. That winter, it was so cold, they lost a large number of ponies and could not bring in the usual number of robes and dried meat. The next winter, the last winter in Kansas, few of the tribe took the trail west to Buffalo Country because their old grounds were being settled by the whites. At the same time, they witnessed their ancestors' graves being desecrated, their prairie homeland was being plowed, and groves were cut down. Their emotional and spiritual bond with their land was replaced with pain, suffering, and sickness.
By 1870, a half century after arriving in Molochna, the Khortytsa and Molochna Mennonite settlements numbered about 45,000, having grown from the 9,000 who had migrated from Prussia to the Ukraine. The community needed more farmland for their growing families. Also, because the Russian government needed money to fund their wars and young men to fight in their wars, my people felt their culture, language, and beliefs were again being threatened by government. So the Mennonites began discussing the possibility of moving to Kansas, which they understood to be uninhabited and to which they were being invited. 60 years after the Louisiana Purchase, the US government was interested in developing its new land. Kansas became a state in 1861. The following year, President Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, offering 160 acres of free land to any head of household willing to develop it. That same year, Congress passed a series of Pacific Railroad Acts granting railroad companies 1/6 of the land in Kansas for the promotion of a transcontinental railroad and land they could sell for economic development and the production of agricultural products. Everywhere there were advertisements to come to the most fertile fields of Kansas. My great-great-grandparents took advantage of this opportunity and came to Kansas with approximately 4,000 others during late 1873 and 1874.
This is a painting that my husband and I commissioned by Chris Papan, who's an Osage, Kaw, and Sioux artist. He painted Chief Washunga over the railroad poster, then went back and added the letters to make it appear they are bleeding through. It depicts the fading Native American culture and the emerging white culture.
After a month-long journey by ship and train, having carefully packed and transported provisions, the Mennonites disembarked in the evening at Peabody. A representative of the railroad met them at the station, and they set out to walk the approximately 20 miles to their new home in the future Gossel area, arriving at their destination at 3 in the early hours of the morning. There, they found 2 long buildings, which the Santa Fe Railroad had built to shelter the immigrants during the winter, or until their own homes could be built.
In 1873, there were 533 Konza people left, and they were forced to go to Indian Territory. It took them 17 days to walk the 165 miles to their new home. When they arrived, no provisions had been made for them. Soon many more died of typhoid, malnutrition, and even starvation. To put this in perspective, in 1839, there were approximately 1,600 Konza. After removal to Indian Territory, by 1887, there were only 193 people left. That is a decline of almost 88% in less than 50 years. That is equivalent to the loss of the entire US population except residents of California. The elders thought they'd been sent to Indian Territory to die, and they gave away all of their sacred objects. They even gave the men's ceremonial Eloshka dance to the Osage. It was during this time that my grandmother was born in a teepee on the banks of Little Beaver Creek in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. Her father died when she was 5, and her mother, who was Kaw Potawatomi, didn't have the means to care for her and her little brother. She went back to her Potawatomi family and left the children with the Kaws. Washunga was the chief, and he took them in.
On arrival, members of the Alexanderville group unpacked their treasured items. I have a clay pot in my living room, which may have contained seed wheat, which had been sorted kernel by kernel to bring only the fattest and best. Family Bibles, Russian clocks, and other items of cultural significance had been carried across the ocean and were carefully placed in their new homes in Marion County. Once in Kansas, members of the Alexanderville community were able to continue speaking and worshiping in their own language. Low German was still commonly spoken when I was born. The Unruhs, Voths, Schmidts, and their neighbors were free to worship as they wished, though it was not always easy. While the Mennonites' peace convictions were challenged in World War I when some young men were drafted to go to Fort Riley, Mennonites and others were later able to claim conscientious objector status.
In an attempt to assimilate Native Americans into white society, boarding schools were established. Children were taken from their homes at a young age, sometimes forcefully, and sent to these schools for an education. Their hair was cut, they were punished if they spoke their native language, and they were given white names. They were forced to abandon their identities and culture. Kill the Indian, save the man was the idea behind boarding schools. My grandmother, Lucy Taya, was sent to Haskell Institute in Lawrence, Kansas in 1901 at age 13. Her younger brother, Emmett, joined her there 3 years later. Lucy stayed at Haskell until 1908, when she was sent to the German Hospital of Brooklyn Training School for Nurses in New York City at age 19.
Church, missions, and education were all important to my ancestors. Within a year of their arrival, some of the Alexandriville community had already opened a private school. Other schools followed, and in 1882, a preparatory school began sessions at the Emmental School 3 miles south of Gossel. It soon outgrew that location and was relocated to Halstead in 1883 and closed in 1893 when the recently established Bethel College took over its duties. The Gossel Preparatory School welcomed its first students in 1906. Education was certainly important for my great-grandparents, my grandparents, and my parents. My great-grandfather, David Unruh, was chairman of the Emmental School Board. My grandfather, John Voth, was a member of the Wareham School Board, and my father, Arnold Voth, served on the Gossel School Board for many years. All my aunts and uncles were given the opportunity to attend Bethel College for varying periods of time.
For over 80 years, U.S. federal law banned Native Americans from practicing their traditional religious ceremonies and even outlawed traditional regalia. Ceremonial practices went underground and possessions were hidden. It was not until 1978 that the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed. I have been to events where traditional ceremonies are done and some of our people would not participate. I don't know if that is a fear of practicing the traditional way or because they view the ceremony as being against their Christian beliefs. I chose this photograph because the son of Francis Stumbling Bear, who's on the left in this photo, told me because regalia was outlawed in 1951, they had to go to a costume store to get Indian clothes.
Church was and is important to my family and served both to nurture faith and to maintain the German Mennonite culture. The Alexandriville Church near Gossel was organized by the recent arrivals in 1874 with 265 members. By 1880, the membership had increased to 467. As the population continued to increase, daughter churches soon followed. In 2006, the membership of the Alexandriville Mennonite Church was 600, and the combined membership of daughter churches was 1,400, making a total of about 2,000, an almost tenfold increase. Alexandriville and its daughter churches were supportive of the General Conference Missions Board. Taking advantage of government funding for Indian schools, one of its first missions was to the Native Americans. Among the many who were sent out to the mission field was Heinrich Rickert Voth, my first cousin 3 times removed. Voth was born in Moluchna in 1855 and was a member of the Alexandriville Mennonite Church. He was sent out by Alexandriville and the Mission Board to work with the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Hopi peoples, as well as serving as superintendent of the Mennonite Indian Industrial School in Halstead, Kansas. He was a careful observer of Native American customs and a collector of Native American artifacts, often to the dismay of the people he was observing. While his photos and collections helped to preserve some of the Native American traditions, more recently he has been seen as violating today's professional ethics because his writings and photos made public ceremonial knowledge that should have been private. Despite his fascination with the culture, Voth steadfastly advocated that the survival and progress of the Indians rested on abandonment of that heritage. Voth repudiated the tribe's traditional rituals in favor of Christianity and required all school children to speak only English. His goal, and the goal of the Mennonite Church, was to Christianize the heathen. As S.S. Howery, another Mennonite missionary, reported to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, it is the most important factor in the daily schoolroom to change the heathen Indians and evolve them into civilized and Christian men and women.
In exchange for the land, the ancestors were guaranteed annuity payments. As their land base shrunk and game became scarce, they had to use this income to purchase food and clothing. When funds ran out, traders and merchants would extend credit to them until they received their next payment. As debts rose, they had to sell yet more land to cover their loans. When they were forced to go to Indian Territory in 1873, they had to buy their new reservation from the Osage. They had to wait 8 years for Kansas to pay them for the land, and when they received it, the agreed upon amount had been reduced by almost 40%. After removal, the Dawes Act divided Konza communal land into allotments owned by individuals. Guardians were appointed by a court to help individuals with their finances until they were declared competent to handle their own affairs. Often the guardians were corrupt and stole from their wards at will. Today, Kaw Nation keeps individual history cards on tribal members. Lucy's brother Emmett's card shows he was granted a certificate of competency in 1914. Lucy's card does not show her ever being declared competent. They sold the allotment they had inherited from Washunga in 1914 to her guardian, who was an attorney. In the early 1920s, the Osage were being murdered for their oil head rights. The Kaw reservation was right next to the Osage. Even though the Kaw didn't have head rights, they were scared. They were afraid of losing their land. They needed a leader to help them with business and to deal with the government. In 1922, they elected my grandmother, Lucy, chief of the Kaws. She had the skills they needed at the time. She was educated, spoke excellent English, and owned a business with her husband, John Eads. She served as chief for 12 years. Lucy went to Washington, D.C. to look after the rights of the people in 1924. She made several requests on behalf of the Konza people. They were all denied on the basis that they were contrary to the allotment agreement of 1902. This is when they first learned they'd given up their rights to be a tribe when they signed that agreement. Lucy sold her allotment farm in the 1950s. This was the last land owned by our family. As far as I know, nearly all of the land owned by tribal members in Oklahoma was either sold or stolen.
Mennonites were recognized as good farmers, but through their earlier history had struggled with landlessness. Land and land acquisition was important. Recognizing their skills as an incentive to move to Kansas, the Santa Fe Railroad offered the Alexanderville Group land at $2.50 per acre, half of the then current price of $5 an acre. In coming years, government programs and their timely payments often provided a much-needed cushion during challenging farming years. My aunt, Annette Voth, in a family genealogy, says the following about my great-grandfather. A study of papers left by the Heinrich J.A. Voth family, such as deeds and mortgages, lead one to the conclusion that Heinrich was able to consolidate small holdings to larger ones by buying land, by using the mortgage system available, paying those off by careful management and frugal tastes, and then using increased income to expand his holdings. It appears to have been important to him to help his children get started with acquiring their own farms. My grandfather, John Voth, also expanded his land holdings. He and my grandmother, Catherine, helped the children as they settled on farms of their own. When the children had grown, John and Catherine gave some land to each child, and on their deaths, the children inherited the balance of their land. Again, from Nada's genealogy. But acquiring land was in John's blood, and he was paying for another parcel of land when he died. Now, I and my husband own land that was inherited or purchased with the help of our families, and over the years, we have benefited from government programs.
It wasn't until 1958 that a resolution was drafted to establish a Kaw Nation constitution. The resolution was not approved by the tribe until 1975. The first constitution was not adopted until 1990. The Kaw Nation owns several hundred acres of land in Oklahoma. All but a 5-acre cemetery plot had to be purchased.
I have a wealth of ways to learn about my history and heritage. In Gossel, we have the Mennonite Heritage and Agricultural Museum. Kaufman Museum in North Newton exists partly to preserve the evolving story of Central Plains Mennonites. And the Mennonite Library and Archives at Bethel College in North Newton is available to help people answer questions about the Mennonite past by promoting the study of Anabaptist and Mennonite history. These are only a few of the ways in which we're preserving our history and tradition. Before Pat Penner, who works with the Mennonite Heritage and Agricultural Museum, approached me last fall asking me if I'd be willing to participate in this dialogue, I couldn't have imagined the impact it's had on me. I am glad that I've had this opportunity to consider my history alongside that of the Konza people. A guilty admission here. I really hadn't cared a whole lot about my Alexandriville history prior to doing this work, but seeing it as part of a larger picture made it come alive. I am, however, left with many questions about how differently the Konza people and Mennonite peoples have been treated by governments, by other groups, and particularly about how, though we have sometimes held ourselves apart from government, we have been treated favorably at various times in our history by many different governments and powers. I've also been struck by how one history can be told in very different ways.
Kaw Nation owns 168 acres just southeast of Council Grove, near the site of our last home in Kansas. This was dedicated as Aligawahu Memorial Heritage Park in 2002. There's a monument on the property that was built in 1924 after the remains of an unknown Kaw warrior were discovered. Below the monument is the stabilized remains of the 1861 stone building built for the tribe's interpreter. We invite you to walk the 2-mile-long Konza Heritage Trail that loops through the park, past the bronze plaque of the Kaw tribal seal and the stone ruins of some of the 138 huts the government built as dwellings for the Konza in 1862. In 2013, Kaw Nation was awarded a grant from the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism for a dance arbor and improvements to Aligawahu Park. The arbor was dedicated in 2015, and we danced on our own land in Kansas for the first time in 142 years. Today, we have 3,822 tribal citizens nationwide, but our last full-blood, William Mahuji, died in 2000. We have been self-governing since 1990. We are one of the largest employers in Kay County, Oklahoma. Our revenue comes from state and federal grants, the Brayman Travel Plaza properties, which includes the Rock and Brews Casino and other enterprises. We offer Konza citizens services such as clinical health and dental, higher education assistance, environmental, substance abuse, domestic violence, and child-related care. There are Konza language classes for adults and an immersion class for the children. Cultural activities include the annual Washunga Days Powwow in Council Grove, Kansas, and the Kaw Powwow in Oklahoma. The Voices of the Wind People pageant is performed in Council Grove every other year in September. It tells the story of the Santa Fe Trail, Council Grove, and the Konza people. The 501c3 Konza Heritage Society was formed in 2019. It is our mission to preserve and perpetuate the history, heritage, legacy, traditions, and cultural lifeways of the Konza people for today and future generations. The Big Red Rock is what our Konza ancestors called the Sacred Prayer Rock. For the past 94 years, It resided in Robinson Park in downtown Lawrence. Glaciers from the last ice age dislodged giant quartzite boulders from their homes in what is now South Dakota and Minnesota. Some of these rocks, known as glacial erratics, found new homes in northeastern Kansas. One of these pink quartzite boulders was deposited near the confluence of Shunganunga Creek and the Kansas River near Topeka. It called this spot home for hundreds of thousands of years. The ancestors considered it a sacred ceremonial object and visited it regularly, where they offered prayers to Konza for centuries. In the 1800s, the Konza documented the significance of the rock in a prayer chart. In 2021, the city of Lawrence returned our sacred red rock to us. We are in the process of updating the infrastructure at Aligawahu Memorial Heritage Park, and Ijuje Wahobe was moved there on March 20th. There will be a rematriation celebration during Washunga Days this year on June 22nd, and you're all invited. You can read more about our project at sacredredrock.com. Also, as part of this project, we are creating a documentary and a book. It has taken us centuries to reach the point where we are today. Every generation has had its challenges, but we have much to be thankful for. Weeblahan. And that is our presentation. I think we have time for questions. Is that right, Jill?
We do. That was amazing, ladies. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It really put it into perspective, the human connection. And I think we're probably going to have lots of questions. So please put in the either Kathleen. Does anyone have a question?
I have one to get us started. I might have missed it, but how did you guys meet and decide to embark on this like historical connection together?
Pauline, you want to take it or shall I?
Yes, I'll take it, and then you can take over. In 2019, Florence Schloniger and I developed a similar presentation for her church in Heston, and it was published in the Stories of Repair, which is the Doctrine of Discovery group. And so then I got a call not too long ago from Pat Penner, and she said they were having the 150th anniversary of the Alexander Wall Church founding. Am I getting this right, Annette?
Yes, and Florence's history is a Mennonite history, but of a different group. And so Pat was interested in finding somebody from the Alexanderville group who could insert our particular history and compare it to Florence's history or to Pauline's history. And so she somehow she picked me out amongst the many Alexanderville Voths and Schmidts and Unruhs and asked if I would be willing to kind of work through this. And it's been really interesting. But it's part of the 150th anniversary celebration of the coming of that Mennonite group.
Pat, do you have anything to add to that? I think you're still muted. There you go.
Still muted.
When our committee was putting a program together for us all to learn the history of the Mennonites that came 150 years ago, it just wasn't complete unless we also found out what was happening here before we got here. And so it was my dream to have this. And when I heard Pauline and Florence's story, I said, what an opportunity if we could insert our story in there. And I have been very impressed. It's worked well.
I have a question for you, Pauline. One thing I've been trying to do with my education program is to connect visiting students with the heritage of the indigenous people of this site. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts of what you could imagine our education program doing. If you have any ideas, thoughts, or suggestions of what could be done to expand the connections between people and the heritage of this site.
That's a good question. It's always a challenge because Kaw Nation headquarters are in Oklahoma, and that's where the majority of the Konza people live. And it's a bit of a travel for them to come up here, you know, for anything. I've done what I can, but I'm about done. So, and I think you've had Storm Brave maybe come to Konza Prairie. She is our language director, and she teaches the immersion class to the children. And she, I think that has been a good addition for you.
She's and we have a little flip book of Kaw words that we've been teaching the docents to then teach the kids that come and visit. So they're starting to learn Kaw words for things like grass and bison and green and that kind of thing. And
Oh,
so,
nice.
yeah, so we're starting to incorporate that into our education curriculum. So
And I know Charlie Huffman has worked with you also.
yes, yes. So we've got some roots started. They're starting to grow. Yeah, and so I see connections continuing.
Yes, there aren't that many Kaw people in Kansas, which is, I would love to see that change. And now that we are getting tuition assistance at K-State, that's a possibility. We're doing more at Oligawahoo Park. And so if we have programs there, you would certainly be invited to come to those. And I hope you can come and bring some of your students to Washunga Days on June 22nd. The powwow is in the evening. We're doing the rematriation celebration in the afternoon at 2, and then the grand entry for the powwow is at 7:30 that evening. So anybody
Nice.
that can make that, we would love to see you.
I have a related question, which is the Voices of the Wind people open to the public too?
It is open to the public,
Okay.
and I don't believe they're doing it this year. I think it will be next year for the 200th anniversary of the Santa Fe Trail, perhaps.
That's what
It's
it says on the
usually-
internet too.
Usually in September, and it goes for Friday and Saturday night. I think there is an admission to that, but it's well worth it. It's a really good program.
I have a question. This was such a fascinating parallel history that you both shared with us. I think it was really, it was informative, but also really emotional, thinking about the pride you take in your histories. And I was wondering if you could share a little more about the process of how you discovered all of this information, if it was passed down that you kind of already knew it, or if you had to do a lot of research to find this out from both sides. And maybe if you could share any of the things that you found most surprising when you were looking through these histories.
Well, I started researching my family history. I mean, I knew a lot of it. I knew that my grandmother was chief and she was born in a teepee. But my father was the Kaw, and he died when I was 14, and we kind of lost contact with the Kaw people. So when I retired, that was my goal. I wanted to reconnect with the Kaw people and learn more about the history, culture, heritage. So I joined the Kaw Nation Cultural Committee, and where I learned a lot. But then I decided that, well, I had met somebody on the Santa Fe Trail group that did first-person historical performances, Joyce Thayer from Emporia State. And I said, I have a story to tell. And she's like, well, what is it? And so I told her about my grandma, and she said, oh, you've got to tell that story. So her and my husband kind of pushed me out there. And so I started researching for that, and I learned a lot more about the history. And then in 2019, I met Florence Schloniger. I did my Chief Lucy presentation at Bethel College, and I got a call from Karen Kaufman-Wall, who was the director of Mennonite district office in North Newton. And she said, we have a retired Mennonite pastor that's interested in making a symbolic land reparation donation to the Kaw people. And I was like, what? So I met Florence, and she made a donation, and I called Jim Pepper Henry, who was a Kaw friend of mine, and I said, so what do we do? And he said, well, I have a nonprofit that I've kept alive for several years, but we're not really using it. And we can change it to Konza Heritage Society and have our own nonprofit side. And I said, that's perfect. And so that's how the Konza Heritage Society got started. And then Florence actually came up with the idea of telling our stories side by side. And then I think Annette told you about how we connected.
Yeah, and then when I started, I've had a general knowledge of my history. I grew up with it all, but I took Pauline and Florence's narrative and looked at the particular dates and time periods, and then tried to do, look at my own history and pick out what was happening in my family at those points in time. Looking through some genealogies, reading, it's a good time to try and do something like that. There are just so many resources online that you can pull up as well. So you kind of start Googling and trying to figure out what's going on with your own family history and just gradually fill in the gaps. And there are some really good resources, Pat and Brian Stuckey and some other people from the Gossel area who kind of double checked my facts, because I'm no expert in Mennonite history. But it was really, and then I went back and read some more history of the Konza people and thought about that in conjunction with what I'd found out about my own history. And it's a really interesting process. If any of you are inspired, you ought to try and fill in your own history against this, because it's enlightening. It's interesting. I think for me, it becomes very apparent that land was incredibly important in my history, but in a very different way than it was important in Pauline's history. And so that's something to think about. You just become aware of, there was the fact that the government promised to pay the Konza $8,000, and they only got 40% of it. I think that I'm getting my numbers right. Whereas we were sold land which should have been sold at $5, but we were given a bargain of $2.50 an acre. So it's just really interesting thinking about the way some of these happened.
Interesting, but very sad.
Thank you, Pat.
Very. Thank you very much, ladies. We appreciate you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you. And
important stories. Very much. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'm going to pass this back over to Jesse.
All right. Yeah, I just want to echo that. That was amazing. I can tell from the expressions on people's faces how much everyone appreciated hearing from you and hearing these perspectives. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you for your time, making it available to us. And